Hello, chess fans. Today's game was played by Mikhail Tal in 1971 in Moscow against the German player Wolfgang Uhlmann. In this position, Uhlmann got a little bit too greedy and captured a pawn here on c3. Even though he had to have known this was a risky decision, I do not think he could have anticipated how quick the execution would be. Backing up to the beginning of the game, we see Tal open up with e4 and Uhlmann responds with pawn to e6. In fact, Uhlmann is a very committed French defense player, a great popularizer of the opening, and as a French defense player myself, I've studied many of his games. After pawn to e6, we see d4, d5, knight d2, the Tarrasch variation, and here we see pawn c5. I don't like this move, but that's totally a personal thing because as a player who plays the white side of this variation, this tends to be the most solid and occasionally boring option available to black. In practice, it's an excellent move, of course. Now, often you're going to see exchanges here that really reduce the pressure, but Tal likes to keep the tension, likes to keep pieces on the board, so he's going to do that with knight f3 here after knight c6, which is a little less popular than exchanging on d4 right away. We see bishop to b5, an exchange on e4, the knight captures back, and now bishop d7. Now, actually, as soon as the bishop came to b5, pawn to a6, kind of tickling that bishop might have been a good decision. Here, white should be able to get some initiative by taking on c5, and now queen a5 check seems a little inconvenient, but if you pull back with knight c3 and black captures on c5, there have been a few games and white's managed to get a little bit of a plus, managed to outscore black. I mean, white does have slightly more active pieces. White also has a queenside pawn majority, so there's a little bit of an advantage for white to work with in this position. Instead, though, Tal plays just a little too aggressively here. He plays bishop to g5, and that just encourages the queen to go to a5 check, which she was going to do in the variation which we were just looking at. And also the bishop on g5 can be in a little bit of trouble here. So knight c3 is forced, and now black is exchanging on d4, better for black than if white was the one doing it. And now after knight takes d4, a good move would have been pawn to a6. Because of the vulnerability along the fifth rank here, you're going to need to exchange off this bishop, and when you do, you're losing a lot of your initiative as white, and black should be doing more than fine after that exchange on c6. Instead, Uhlmann tries bishop to b4. This is a little bit of a greedy move because it's looking to win a pawn by capturing that knight on c3. But white has 4 pieces developed right now. If you go and win a pawn, you're not furthering your development, and that naturally invites Tal's next move. He goes ahead and castles and says, have that pawn. I'm just going to focus on the principles, development, and castling, and let's see if your king can survive here on e8. Now, Uhlmann should have at this point decided that discretion was the better part of valor and made a move like pawn to h6, choosing not to go ahead and capture this pawn on c3, but instead he decided he could get away with it. He played bishop takes c3, pawn takes, and he followed through with queen takes c3. This is a fantastic moment to pause your video and try and figure out how you would attack the black position after black has accepted this pawn. Well, if you spent some time here, you might have found the incredible move knight to f5. Now, even without this move, white would have some compensation, but not more than some compensation. This move, though, completely crushes the black position. This is pretty much winning on the spot. It is a fantastic move. Now, after knight to f5, you have to take this knight because otherwise knight to d6 check or knight takes g7 are coming and they're just too strong. I mean, you might try and defend those positions, but there's no reason to expect to be able to defend successfully if you allow the knight into one of these squares. So not seeing a clear loss yet, probably because it's difficult to calculate, but not because the clear loss isn't there. Uhlmann does decide to play e takes f5. Now, obviously, this opens up the e file right here, which is very, very scary. So after e takes f5, Tal plays the accurate move and immediately goes rook to e1 check, focusing in on that e file. Now, in this position, your only choice really is to block with the bishop on e6. If you try to block with a knight, the problem is the pressure on d7. So you can capture on e7 with the rook or the bishop. The rook is a little more forcing, and if the knight captures back, this is obviously devastating and winning. So after knight f5 ef, rook e1 check, that bishop does block on e6. And now just a beautiful move, encroaching on the black position, queen to d6. This is basically just announcing Zugzwang in this position. What productive moves can Uhlmann make right here? He can't move this knight because if it goes anywhere, including to e7, then simply capturing here or moving the queen here is mate here on e7. Also, the bishop is pinned. The queen can move, but she doesn't really have productive squares to move to, and the rooks really aren't able to get out. That leaves some pawn moves, and we'll look at that in a moment. I should mention the possibility here of knight to f6, which is the one move the knight can make without allowing mate here on e7. Now, after knight to f6, here is the winning plan for white that would work if black just kind of tried to sit on the position. You can play rook a to d1 right here, which is creating large threats, including sacrifices on e6 and possibly taking on f6 and then coming in here to d7. If black tries a move like h6, which makes a lot of sense, it's hard to recommend something better, we can go ahead and capture here on f6, and after gf, rook takes e6, pawn takes, queen takes, and the rook can go to d7 is a winning idea. It is really, really hard to stop ideas like this from crushing the black position. Notice that there's no mate here on the back rank because bishop f1 always stops that, and there's no way to hold against the various mates that are threatened here on the 7th rank. So this is pretty much a forced mate position. Faced with these kinds of threats, Uhlmann decides he needs to get rid of this bishop. This is the dangerous bishop in the position here. So he plays pawn to a6 to attack that bishop and try to push it back. And this is another good moment to pause your video and try to play like Mikhail Tal. Well, if you found the next move, then congratulations. I think it's the finest move in the game. Knight f5 is beautiful and brilliant, but the key to this whole attack is the move bishop to d2. If you don't have bishop to d2 in this position, the whole attack is at least a little bit speculative, but bishop d2, rerouting the bishop over to a different, more effective diagonal is winning. So bishop d2 obviously hits the queen here on c3. That queen needs to move, so she might as well capture here on c2. She does, and now bishop to b4. So in this position, we're threatening queen to f8 check, which will win material and also create a devastating attack. This is the last moment to kind of try to find a defense for black, but there isn't one to be found. For example, if you try a move like rook to d8, attacking the queen here, then we can simply sacrifice on e6 check beautifully. Pawn takes, queen takes. You can only block with the knight on the 8th rank, and when we take, it is mate because this knight is pinned. A beautiful possible finish to the game. Alternatively, if you try something a little bit slower here, like rook to c8, which does defend this undefended rook, then a very, very strong move of many strong moves is rook to d1. And this threatens a lot of things, including rook takes e6 again, including sometimes queen d7, which is actually mate on the board. And now that we've covered the d file, queen f8 is also mate. In fact, the computer says it is mate in 3 in this position, and black can only delay it with really desperate moves like queen takes d1. So with no actual successful defense to find here, Uhlmann ultimately did capture the bishop here on b5, but now queen f8 check comes. This rook is hanging after the king moves. We do get a nice accurate move from Tal. He includes this rook in the participation on the d-file assault, pushing the king over to c7, and then he captures on a8. Capturing on a8 right away would have been good, but this is a little bit more precise. For example, now you cannot capture here on b4 because you walk into mate in 2 just like this. So, no longer in possession of a real material advantage and facing ideas like rook to c1 and then queen to d8 checkmating, and also sometimes bishop a5 and bishop d6, and not really having the ability to move this knight or this rook because of pressure here along the 8th rank, Uhlmann ultimately decided that this position here on the 19th move was the correct one to resign. I hope that you enjoyed this game. I think it's one of Tal's finest miniatures. If you want to see more great miniatures from Tal or more great games in general, then click on the playlist sitting right on top of the chessboard.